The moderation process involves many different stages. It is essential for a school to follow all the stages to ensure that their process is actually effective. Many schools tend to focus only on one of the stages. As we're going through this, please reflect to see how your school does things and think about how you could improve the way that you moderate in your school. So there are 3 key stages. The first stage is what we call the pre-marking stage, which has 3 different aspects to it, which we'll discuss just now. The second stage is the marking stage, and this is what most schools do focus on. And the third stage, which many schools forget about, is what we call the post-marking stage. And this is an essential part as it provides the most feedback to the process of teaching, learning, and assessment. Now let's have a look at each of these stages individually. The first is the pre-marking stage. Now the aim of the pre-marking stage is to evaluate the quality of content and skills. Now what do we mean by this? Well, what are we evaluating? We're evaluating the design and development of the curriculum. We're evaluating the quality and standards of the curriculum, and then of course the intended outcome. Now, for most of us, these are set already in the curriculum statements. So we have to make sure that not only are we following the curriculum, but we're doing it to the best of our ability, and we're bringing out the best in the curriculum for our learners, and we're making sure that we're achieving those standards and quality. The next aspect of the pre-marking stage, remember we're still before the actual marking, the learners haven't even started writing yet. We need to evaluate the planning and implementation of the content and skills. So this aspect looks at how well did we plan for our teaching, learning, and assessments? How well did we implement the teaching, learning, assessments in the classroom? What is the quality of the teaching and learning? And then what methodologies did we use? And these sort of aspects need to be done before the learners even write the assessment, because if the quality of teaching and learning has not been correct or not at the right standards, we need to improve this before we even give the assessment to the learners. Otherwise, the assessment doesn't actually mean much. And then the third aspect, before we actually give the learners the assessment to do, is the evaluation of the quality of the actual assessment task. So the task that we've been given. So the first 2 stages of the pre-marking were really about what goes on before we develop this assessment task. Now we've actually got the assessment task. So now we look at the design and development of the assessment task, the quality and standards of the assessment, and then whether the assessment meets the intended outcome. Now this is really important. Are we actually, the questions we're asking in that test or exam, is it actually meeting the standards of what we want from the learners? Are the questions too easy, too difficult? Are they what the original curriculum intended for us to assess? So what are we actually looking for when we evaluate an assessment task? Well, there are 4 key things. The first is we're looking for validity. And we know that an assessment is valid when it assesses the intended skills and content. It's got the appropriate assessment tool to assess the learner's performance against what the intended content and skills actually are. And then most importantly, it allows the learners to produce adequate evidence of the required skills and content. We've got to make sure that the actual assessment task gives them the opportunity. So if we're looking to test understanding of something, if we don't give the learners the opportunity in the task to show that they understand, that task is not valid. The next is reliability. And we know an assessment is reliable when the assessors apply consistent conditions of assessment. For example, open book test versus closed book, invigilation, how the learners are invigilated, are they helped along the way, even coming down to in the classroom, how the content is taught and guidelines given to some learners versus others. We also know it's reliable when objective decisions are made in the marking. We also need to make sure there's authentic evidence of the learner's work and that judgments are made on performance criteria. And then, of course, that all assessors are consistent across all learners. The next aspect is practicality or practicability. The assessment is practical when it does not place unreasonable demands on the teacher and the learners. And when we talk about this, we're looking at different aspects. The first is the design and development of the task, the number of assessments, the time and resources available, the evidence required from the learner, time allocated for marking, workload on both the teacher and the learner, and then emphasis on the assessment tasks. So if you look at that, you want to make sure that you've given the learners enough time to actually perform in the task and be able to show what their skills and knowledge is. You also need to make sure that the time allocated for marking is sufficient. Otherwise, the teachers are not going to mark appropriately and effectively for that task. So your results aren't going to be meaningful. And then, of course, things like the development and design of the task. It must be conducive to being able to answer the questions. It must be clear, papers must be printed correctly, clearly, numbering done, and so on. And then the last aspect is fairness. And we know an assessment is fair when it provides all learners with an equal opportunity. Also, we need to make sure that there's equal access for all learners to resources. The teachers mark in an unbiased and non-discriminatory way. That previous experiences with learners don't influence the teacher. And that's a big one, because often we fall on what we know the learners can and can't do in previous assessments. And we tend to mark in a different way. So we've got to make sure that we are unbiased there, and that the instructions for the actual assessment are unambiguous. So that makes sure that we don't discriminate against any, or advantage in that case, any learner. So those are the 4 aspects that we are looking for when we're evaluating an assessment task. Now we've looked at the pre-marking stage. Now let's move on to the actual marking stage. And this is when we evaluate the actual assessment process. So the assessment process is from when the learner gets the task to do, while they're doing it, and then after they've finished it, and that when the teacher marks it. So remember, we've looked up to now to the process before the learners even got the task. Now we're looking at when they actually do the task and the marking of it. And this is the stage that most schools, if they're getting aspects of moderation right, they're getting this part right. What we need to encourage schools to do is not only this part or this process, this stage, but also the pre and the post marking stage. So let's have a look at what are we actually doing when we're evaluating the assessment process. Well, there are 4 key things. We're looking at the quality of the marking and the assessment. So we're looking at the questions, and we're looking at the memo. And we're looking at how well the teacher has applied the memo to the marking. The next is looking at the judgments on the learner's work. Has the teacher actually judged the learner and what they have said or done in the task correctly? Have they made the correct judgments? We're then also looking at the consistency of the judgments made. Is it being made the same for every learner? Is every learner, when they answer something, are they getting the same marks or results or comments? And then, of course, the objectivity of the assessment. Has the assessor actually been objective? And this is quite a difficult task, looking at all 4 of those, because this is where our results come from. This is where, if we've got the pre-marking stage correct, we need to make sure that we have marked correctly. And it's not just about the ticks and the crosses. It's also about the comments we make. Because remember, assessment is about improving the learner's work. Now, the assessment policy is an essential document that provides the school, managers, educators, learners, and parents for that matter, with a guideline on the assessment and moderation processes. And make sure that you check all the time and reassess your assessment policy to check that it does include what is meant to be included in it. The attached PDF after this video clip will give you a checklist on what factors should be in your actual assessment policy. Please go through that and double check that you do have that in your assessment policy. Now let's look at the post-marking stage. Now this stage is the stage that's often forgotten in schools. Often after assessments, particularly at the end of the term, we've handed our marks and now it's holidays, and we forget about the importance of feedback and looking at how we can improve in the future and in different ways for our assessment. And this stage of post-marking, or of moderation, the post-marking stage, is possibly the most important, because this is where we are evaluating our assessment results with the idea of improving. So why are we evaluating? What are we looking for? Well, the first is we want to verify the accuracy of the assessment results. That's the most important. Then we want to evaluate whether the assessment actually reflected the original intended outcome of the curriculum. Let's use, for example, the learners do a poster. And the poster is this wonderful, they do a whole lot of wonderful, pretty posters. They spend a lot of time on it and everything. But at the end of the day, your poster was assessing a certain level of understanding. And you look back on these posters and realize, but this didn't actually reflect that at all. And the marks don't necessarily reflect that outcome. Now, it's the postmarking stage that shows us that, where we look back and say, well, next time we must do things differently. It's also an important time to evaluate the assessment results against the learner's ability. Sometimes we end up with a really good set of results, but when we look at the learner's ability, it doesn't reflect that accurately. And then, of course, a very, very powerful reflection tool is to be able to evaluate the spread of results against the bell curve or another appropriate statistical analysis method. Now, I'm going to just give you a brief introduction to the bell curve. And it's not for everyone, and as I said, there's a lot of different statistical methods to use. But somehow we need to use some method to see whether we're on the right track with our teaching and our learning and our assessment. So the bell curve is an effective method because it ensures the spread of levels and makes sure that it's all accurate. So if you have a look at this diagram here, most of the learners should lie between 40 and 60% mark on an average bell curve. So that light blue in the middle, that's where most learners should lie. And of course, this is assuming that the assessment is of standard, that the teaching is of standard, and that the learners are a true representation of a larger group. So in other words, groups less than 25 learners, you need to obviously apply a little bit of caution to it. But any group over 25, you should have some sort of natural spread. And what this bell curve does is it implies that the lower levels should have fewer learners who are not achieving. The middle levels should represent 40 to 60% of the learners. And then the higher levels have fewer learners again. So if this sort of data analysis interests you, and it's not everyone's cup of tea, but schools do need to find some way of measuring and analyzing their data. But we have a specific course on data or data analysis for schools. So have a look on the site and see whether you want to do that course, because that'll give you a deeper insight into how to analyze data using a statistical analysis method. Right, and then in terms of the stage 3, we've got one more aspect, which is the final stage, or the final step in all the stages of moderation. And that is the feedback on the assessment process. And this is probably the most valuable and important stage. And this stage allows us to provide feedback and practical suggestions on how to improve in different aspects. And in particular, we want to improve the quality of the content and skills. We want to improve the quality of planning and implementation. So remember, that's looking right back to the beginning of how did we teach? How did we plan to teach? How do we implement our teaching before we even gave the assessment task to the learners? And then, of course, looking at the quality of the assessment task and process. Now remember, we looked at that in the actual marking stage. This stage is looking at how do we improve? What are the practical solutions and suggestions to making this process better and to making the results better? And then, of course, to look at how do we improve the assessment results. Now, this is so important in an entire school's planning process. And this is why following the entire moderation process is essential. Because if we don't provide this feedback to teachers, they're not going to change the way they do things. And we're not going to be able to improve. So if we look at the moderation process in summary and holistically, we had the pre-marking stage where we evaluated the quality of content and skills. We evaluated the planning and implementation of the content and skills, so that's in the classroom before the assessment is given. And then we evaluated the quality of the assessment. Now remember, at this stage, it still hasn't been given to the learners. This is all before the learners actually sit down and write this test or do the task. Then we've got the marking stage. So now the learners have done the task or are doing it. And we evaluate the assessment process there. And remember, that includes the marking, that includes the environment, the validity, and all of those aspects. And then we've got the postmarking stage, where we said with two steps there: evaluating the actual results, but evaluating with the idea of improving. But most importantly, giving feedback on the entire assessment process, and of course on the entire moderation process, so the pre-marking stage, the marking stage, and the post-marking stage. Now hopefully that gives you a very holistic idea of what a moderation process should look at from beginning to end. Now you'll see there's a downloadable PDF after this video clip, which provides you with a whole lot of checklists in the document to check whether you are actually in your school going through all these processes. And I urge you, if you're responsible for moderation, or if you want to put a better moderation process in place, use these checklists for the teachers and use them for yourself to make sure that you do actually address every stage necessary.